Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we break down complex science, giving you the core insights fast. Today, we're tackling a huge topic, the origin of life itself. We're going from the molecular level, the blueprint, all the way up to the first cells, and crucially, how selection got started. We're drawing this directly from Strickberger's evolution, really focusing on that foundational material for you.
Exactly. The goal here is to trace that incredible journey from non-life to life. We'll start with how things work now, DNA, RNA, protein. Then we'll explore the leading idea for how it began, the RNA World hypothesis. And importantly, how did these molecules actually get organized into protocells, moving from just chemistry to, well, biology?
Okay, let's unpack that. Starting with the current system, the central dogma. It's fundamental, isn't it? The rule book for information in biology.
It absolutely is. The core idea is simple but powerful. Structure determines function. And for proteins, their incredibly complex 3D shapes, which allow them to do things, come directly from the linear sequence of their amino acids.
Right. And that amino acid sequence is coded by the sequence of bases in nucleic acids in our genes.
Precisely. So there's this directional flow, gene to functional molecule. It's like a one-way street for information.
And this flow breaks down into three key processes. First up, replication.
Yep. DNA making copies of itself. DNA to DNA. That's inheritance, plain and simple.
Then comes transcription.
That's where the message from a specific gene in the DNA gets copied into an RNA molecule. So DNA to RNA, like making a working copy of a blueprint section.
And the final step is translation.
Right. RNA to protein. This is where the RNA message is read. And a protein chain, a peptide, is actually built based on that code. And this whole translation process absolutely relies on three main types of RNA working together.
Ah, yes, the functional RNAs.
Exactly. You've got messenger RNA, the mRNA. That's the one carrying the actual code, the sequence info from the DNA.
Okay.
And then transfer RNA, tRNA. Think of it as the adapter. It reads the mRNA code and brings the correct amino acid to the ribosome.
The ribosome being the construction site.
The construction site, yeah. And it's largely made of ribosomal RNA, rRNA.
I guess
like the 16S RNA in bacteria or 18S in eukaryotes. That S is just a Strickberger unit, a measure of size based on sedimentation rate. That's where the protein synthesis actually happens.
And the link between the RNA code and the protein building blocks is the triplet rule.
Yes. 3 bases on the mRNA, what we call a codon, specify which one of the 20 standard amino acids should be added next.
20 amino acids. That seems like a key number. It provides a huge amount of variety compared to the 4 bases in nucleic acid.
Oh, absolutely huge. Think about it this way. A 5 nucleotide sequence gives you, what, 4 to the power of 5? That's only 1,024 possibilities.
Wow.
But a 5 amino acid sequence with 20 options for each position, that's 20 to the power of 5, over 3 million different possible sequences.
Wow.
That enormous difference in potential complexity is why proteins can fold into such intricate shapes and perform all the complex jobs needed for life. Nucleic acids are great for storing information, but proteins are built for action.
Okay, that makes sense for today. But it leads to a really big question, a kind of evolutionary puzzle, right?
The big one.
If DNA needs proteins to replicate, and proteins need DNA and RNA to be made, how on earth did this whole interdependent system get started? Replication, transcription, translation, they all rely on each other. Which came first?
That is the classic chicken and egg problem in molecular evolution. And it's precisely this puzzle that led Leslie Orgel, Francis Crick, and Carl Woese, working independently, to propose the RNA World hypothesis.
The RNA World. Okay, so what's the core idea?
The idea is that early on, RNA did it all. It was both the genetic material, storing the information like DNA does now, and the catalytic molecule, doing the work like proteins do now.
So RNA was playing double duty. What's the evidence for this? It sounds like a neat idea, but is there proof?
Well, the strongest evidence came with the discovery of ribozymes.
Right, RNA enzymes.
Exactly. It turned out that RNA molecules themselves can act as catalysts. They can cut, splice, join, and even, crucially, replicate other RNA molecules. This completely overturned the old dogma that only proteins could be enzymes and showed that an RNA-based self-replication system was, chemically speaking, feasible.
So nature provided the proof of concept.
It did. And there's more. Some RNA molecules in our cells today are involved in reactions using ATP, the main energy currency. That suggests RNA was involved in energy metabolism early on, too. Plus, lab experiments have shown you can artificially select RNA molecules for specific catalytic jobs, making them millions of times more efficient. Like getting RNA to link a ribose sugar to a base. The potential is there.
And isn't the ribosome itself kind of a smoking gun?
You could definitely say that. The heart of the ribosome, the part that actually forms the peptide bond between amino acids at the peptidyl-transferase center, is primarily made of ribosomal RNA, not protein. It strongly suggests that protein synthesis originally evolved in an RNA-dominated world. The RNA is still doing the heavy lifting there.
Okay, the RNA world sounds pretty compelling, but the source mentions a potential snag, the stability of ribose, the sugar in RNA's backbone.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Ribose isn't the most stable sugar under plausible early Earth conditions. It's a challenge. But researchers like G.E. Joyce have suggested that maybe the very first genetic systems didn't use ribose exactly, but perhaps more stable, similar molecules, ribose analogs that could still do the job. The principle holds, even if the exact initial chemistry was slightly different.
Okay, so we have the information molecule, maybe starting as RNA, but information needs containment, right? Needs organization.
Precisely. The next critical step, happening sometime before about 3.5 billion years ago, was the organization of molecules into membranes, vesicles, essentially the first protocells. This is the leap from just chemistry floating around to something with individuality.
And this hinges on a specific type of molecule.
It does. Phospholipids.
Yeah.
These are the key players. They have a sort of split personality, chemically speaking. One end, the phosphate head, is polar. It loves water, hydrophilic. The other end consists of fatty acid tails that are nonpolar. They hate water, hydrophobic.
And that love-hate relationship with water forces them to organize.
Spontaneously. Put them in water, and they naturally arrange themselves into a bimolecular layer, or bilayer, often forming a closed sphere or vesicle. The tails hide inside, away from the water, and the heads face outwards, interacting with the water. This automatically creates a barrier, trapping whatever molecules were inside and establishing an internal environment distinct from the outside. That's selective permeability starting to happen.
So that simple structure, that membrane bubble, is basically a protocell.
In essence, yes. A membrane-bounded system that has some organization, controls what comes in and out, maybe uses some energy, and importantly, can be acted upon by selection. It's the first hint of the self. And what's really profound is that this self-assembly isn't some biological magic. It's just the physics and chemistry of these molecules in water. Organization was almost inevitable.
And scientists were modeling this possibility quite early on, weren't they? Oparin and Fox.
That's right. Alexander Oparin studied coacervates. These are like little droplets of organic molecules that spontaneously separate out from a solution under certain conditions. He showed they could maintain some internal organization, grow, and even incorporate enzymes to carry out simple reactions like making starch.
Okay, and Fox.
Sidney Fox worked with microspheres. He created these by heating amino acids to form protein-like polymers, then cooling them in water. These formed uniform, double-layered spheres that showed some remarkably lifelike behaviors. Selective absorption, osmosis, even budding or splitting, almost like primitive cell division.
So these classic experiments showed that non-biological processes could create structures with some of the basic properties of cells.
Exactly. They demonstrated that compartment formation wasn't the biggest hurdle. And modern research, like Jack Szostak's work, takes this further. They're using fatty acid membranes, more plausible for early Earth, and putting things like replicating RNA molecules inside. They've shown that protocells containing more efficient RNA replicators can actually grow faster and essentially steal resources from less efficient ones.
Ah, so competition and selection can happen even at this very simple protocell level.
Absolutely. That organization, that boundary, creates individuals. And as soon as you have individuals competing for resources, selection starts. This is really the bridge between purely chemical evolution molecules just reacting and biological evolution acting on these organized units.
So what conditions were needed for this very early form of selection to get going?
It's surprisingly basic. First, you need a population of individuals, could be molecules, could be protocells. Second, these individuals need to take in material or energy from the environment and use it to, well, maintain themselves or grow. Third, there has to be variation. They need to differ, even slightly, in how efficiently they do this. And finally, resources or energy have to be limited. Otherwise, there's no pressure, no competition.
Got it. Population, resource use, variation, and limits.
That's the recipe. Initially, selection probably just favored protocells or molecular systems that were better at persisting, better at maintaining their structure and organization against breakdown, not necessarily reproducing yet. But over time, as systems gain the ability to reproduce, even crudely, and pass on their variations, this process evolved into natural selection, as we usually think of it, favoring differential reproductive success.
Yeah.
That protocell boundary was the key step towards individuality.
It created the unit upon which selection could really act. Okay, so that establishes the path to early cellular life. But what about things that seem to exist on the edge, blurring the lines, like viruses and prions?
Yeah, they're fascinating because they highlight just how crucial that independence and organization are. Let's start with viruses. They're basically just genetic material, either DNA or RNA, wrapped in a protein coat. They're infectious agents, but they are completely dependent on host cells. They hijack the host's machinery to replicate.
They can't do it on their own.
Not at all. And it's interesting, RNA viruses tend to mutate much faster than DNA viruses, which helps them evolve rapidly. Think about flu viruses changing every year.
The book gives the example of the T4 bacteriophage infecting E. coli. It sounds incredibly complex for something not quite alive.
It's amazing, like a little molecular machine. It has maybe 30 or 40 different protein components, all genetically programmed. When it infects a bacterium, some of its first genes direct the host cell to make copies of the phage DNA. Then later genes direct the assembly of the head capsule and the tail structure. The DNA gets pumped into the head. There's even a scaffold protein used during assembly that gets destroyed later. Finally, it makes an enzyme, lysozyme, to burst the host cell open and release hundreds of new phages. It's a hostile takeover.
And there's mention of the mimivirus.
Yes, the giant virus. It's huge for a virus with a massive genome. What's particularly interesting is that mimivirus can itself be infected by a smaller virus called a virophage. It kind of muddies the water between virus and host, life and non-life, even further.
Okay, so viruses lack independence. What about prions? They seem even stranger.
They really are. Prions are infectious agents, but they contain no DNA or RNA at all. Zero genetic material in the traditional sense.
How is that even possible? How do they replicate or cause disease?
It's based on protein shape. There's a normal protein found in host cells, called PRP. A prion is simply a misfolded version of this protein. Let's call it PRP. The dangerous part is that when this misfolded PRP encounters a normal PRP protein, it causes the normal one to change its shape and become misfolded too.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly like a domino effect. One misfolded protein triggers others to misfold, leading to clumps of these bad proteins accumulated, particularly in the brain, causing devastating diseases. Think of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, or BSE mad cow disease in cattle, or Kuru, the laughing death found in New Guinea.
So the infection is just the spread of a bad shape.
Precisely. And what's revolutionary here from an evolutionary perspective is that the prion changes the cell's phenotype, its characteristics, purely through protein folding, without altering the DNA sequence at all. It's a form of protein-based inheritance. We even see examples in organisms like yeast, where prion-like protein folding states can be passed down through generations of cells, acting as a kind of epigenetic inheritance.
That really challenges the central dogma's straightforward DNA to protein flow.
It certainly shows that information relevant to phenotype can sometimes be encoded and transmitted through protein structure itself. A fascinating edge case.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We've journeyed from the basic rules of the central dogma through the puzzle of its origin leading to the RNA world.
Then to the absolute necessity of organization via protocells, creating the individuality needed for selection to take hold.
And we saw how selection could operate even before reproduction, eventually becoming the natural selection we know.
And underlying all this, we can't forget the development of energy systems, like using ATP, which would have been crucial. But here's a final thought to leave you with. Given how tightly DNA, RNA, and protein depend on each other today, how incredibly complex must that transition have been? Going from a potentially simpler, maybe RNA-based world to the sophisticated cooperative DNA-RNA protein system we see in all life now. That optimization step seems like a huge evolutionary hurdle.
Yeah, that shift from maybe a generalist RNA system to the specialized roles we see today, it really makes you wonder, and it pushes back on the question, when did life truly begin? Was it with those first self-replicating molecules, perhaps over 4 billion years ago, or only when the first organized, bounded cells emerged, maybe 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago? Something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the molecular origins of life and evolution.